to see if we could get the approvals in order to eliminate the loan aspect of specific claims funding. We weren't able to do that, but it is different than any other loan funding we've done, because we will continue to ensure that once we've agreed upon the settlement amount for a specific claim, that we are augmenting it by the amount of the loan. So we take care of it on the back end, so that we're augmenting the amounts of the claim, so that the loan is in essence still not being taken out of your settlement amount at the end of the day. The settlement amount's augmented to compensate for it. We will continue to make efforts and have the discussions about what to do in terms of the future of specific claims funding and the approach, but we're not able to obtain the funding for that at this point. In terms of the question of whether we're trying to remake the role of the Governor-General, we're not. I mean, I can speak from my experience of prior to this job, when I spent 5 years as the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Machinery of Government at the Privy Council Office, and my job there was as the liaison between the executive branch of government and the Governor-General, as well as with Buckingham Palace and Her Majesty the Queen. That was part of my job, and part of my job was looking after the constitutional conventions that have evolved in this country around the role of the Queen and the role of the Governor-General. And those conventions are fairly long-standing, not in terms of your own respective histories of presence in this country, but they're long-standing within the concept of the Westminster system of government. And we're not doing anything that's changing any of those. Those conventions are what they are, and as I mentioned, they're long-standing for, in some cases, hundreds of years. In terms of the BC treaty process and the question that was raised around, an evidence-based process. Like, I think this is, it's a clear challenge. We know it's a challenge. We know it's a real issue. I think for us, part of the tension has been, trying to figure out how you move forward on a recognitions-based approach. So going through an approach where you're not putting people to having to prove to us their rights or title, but trying to do it on a recognition-based approach. And then how then do you address the issues when other Indigenous nations or groups come forward and contest whether or not what another group is asserting is actually appropriate. And I think that, I agree that for a long time now, the answer from government has been not our problem, over to you to sort out. I don't think that's an adequate response on our part. And I think that we do want to work with Indigenous peoples to figure out, is there some sort of a Indigenous-led institution or some kind of an independent institution that we need to be thinking about developing that could help to address some of these issues and some of these concerns? What are the mechanisms that we can help support to work some of these things out? And we know that there's been, some of this has been pressures caused by how, particularly in the BC context, how lands and resources are looked at, how the land quantum and capital transfers of mandates are calculated. That's all put pressure, I think, on many who have, enlarged their original statements of intent to incorporate further and further area and territory. I think, from our perspective, we need to get back to a place where, these discussions are grounded in the actual governance and laws of the respective Indigenous nations. I'm not sure that Canada's laws or our approaches are going to necessarily resolve these issues. I think we need to get back into a space where we can talk about, things like the idea that in some areas, for example, territory was used by different First Nations at different times of the year for different purposes. In other examples, there were traditional protocols in place around how a neighboring nation would be able to access or part of a territory of another nation in order to do some gathering or some hunting. We need to get back to kind of these concepts and think about how we can support the dialogue around these processes, around what elders are telling us are the way in which things were done before in terms of how some of those issues were being addressed and sorted out and managed. We need to think about whether or not there are other mechanisms that we can put in place as supports around that. So I think we take on our responsibility that we need to figure out ways to help address these issues and not just kind of, wave our hand at them and say, no good. But like I say, the real tension there is about us trying to figure out a space where we're not holding people to providing us with, evidence like you would in a court, because we are trying to have a recognition-based approach. And are there things that we need to do both in terms of how we think about mandates, how we think about broader government revenue sharing? Like, are there things that we can do that would relieve some of the pressure that some of, I think, the processes have created around perhaps people, asserting and claiming territory in order to basically try to get their economic needs met. And so I think there's stuff in all of that we need to unpack and have conversations about. None of it's going to be overnight, but I think we're committed to wanting to have dialogue on these issues.
Yes, I agree totally, and we're learning a lot about by listening to the elders and by seeing the kinds of almost treaties amongst nations that people are talking about. Certainly, with the EU agreement in northern Quebec, where the offshore actually says in the agreement shared that these are things that I think are sometimes a way forward, even around shared title, that there is a way that nations will sort that out, and that's, I think, the future. The issue around children and C-92 and St. Teresa's Point, I have to say that I totally understand the cynicism and the reason why failed promises and paternalism has got in the way of the rights and well-being of Indigenous children to be raised as Indigenous, and has got us into terrible trouble. And so there is no way the federal government wants to dictate. This is really, C-92 is to make sure that nations have the ability to organize the rights and well-being of their children in their own way, in whatever partnerships they choose, based on their own laws and customs. So I think, I couldn't be more clear that this is not about us trying to dictate, it's trying to get us out of the way and actually get the, and to be able to express to provinces and territories that this is your right. In terms of the Cree and the new path forward and inherent in treaty rights, we really do want to go forward in that new path and going forward. And I think that we just learn a lot every time, and we know that it's the nations doing the hard work and coming to us with solutions. As Grand Chief Stuart Phillips, yes, the comp claims and inherent right policies will be off the website. I've kind of wanted them off the website for a very long time. I think we now understand that the directive needs to be in place before, hopefully before Parliament rises, but with it being very clear that it's based on the UN Declaration and on getting rid of cede and surrender and extinguishment and those complete obstacles to self-determination. We hear you, and I don't know if Joe wants to say something about the summit in the UBCIC, but we are prepared to talk with whatever collectivity wants to come and talk to us. We don't see it based on provincial boundaries at all. That if treaty groups that cross provincial boundaries want to come to us in terms of the kinds of conversations like Treaty 5 and others, then that's the way people want to organize. If the Mi'kmaq want to come together first as Nova Scotia and then later, then that's up to them to decide how they want to present. And obviously we would be happy to sit down with you, Grand Chief, to sort out the kinds of things that and for all of the communities that you represent. I think Dutch, I think sort of answered the question on the directive and how we see it will be in keeping with us trying to make sure not only that it's based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and getting rid of cede and surrender and extinguishment, but also the directive needs to apply to all government departments. So that this isn't just the negotiators within my department, this is the way we work as a government. And so in so many of the agreements and the memorandum, letters of understanding, memorandums of understanding, the things that we take to cabinet, it really crosses a number of government departments, which is, I think, an exciting time. And we think it's kind of why the Prime Minister put Crown in my title, that it's not just INAC. It is his understanding that all government departments would honor and respect the new relationship that is in the mandate letter of all ministers, based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. And to Chief Lee Crowchild, yeah, I think that the issue around Crown land is problematic. I think it's problematic in your province. I think that the signal from the new Premier is disturbing. It's not how we see reconciliation. And I think that it is, as we get further along the road on resource revenue sharing and all of the things that are about being able to work nation to nation, that these are things that we want to work out. At the same time as I think that we are doing a better job as our government understanding even the things that were once in Canada lands, that in the previous government would just be sold off to the highest price, that we are now making sure that if at any opportunity, some of the lands, whether it's D&D lands or other lands that become available, that the community needs and First Nations needs are very much taken into consideration as to the disposition of those lands, and making sure that we understand the treaty and inherent right. I think, did you add something?
Sure. I think the only thing that I would add in terms of the points that Grand Chief Lewis is making is, the benefit of working in policy versus legislation is that it's not a one-size-fits-all world at all. So when we talk about policy, it doesn't mean that it's singular. It means that we can tailor policy responses and development to not only whatever processes First Nations want to have, and it can be a myriad of processes, but the outcomes of that can be a myriad of policy responses that work and recognize both the specific circumstances of different groups of First Nations, whether that's those that have treaties, those that don't have treaties, whether it's geographic in nature, what have you. And I think that's just the benefit that we have, is that we're open to engaging in whatever processes rights holders and treaty rights holders want to lead. We're here and we're open to whatever that will be in terms of, the broader policy reform that the minister was talking about, and our commitment to doing that in a way that is going to be co-developed with you and will meet the needs and interests and circumstances of the diverse First Nations across the country who have very different circumstances that we need to make sure we are taking into account.